My name is Dan Sonneson. I'm the director of the Language Center at the University of Minnesota. And welcome to another session of the Language Collaboratory, a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional learning opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature. Our series this spring aims at furthering conversations that help uncover the complexities of striking a balance on professional, academic, and personal goals to achieve the well-being of instructors and students of languages. We address this issue through the lens of our current shared circumstances, approaching it from a variety of perspectives, building on the experiences and expertise of individuals on our own campuses. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat, and during the open discussion period to raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning is available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Our next event will be held 2 weeks from today on April 15th at this time, coming from the University of Wisconsin-Madison on balancing independent and group or pair work. We invite you to join us again 2 weeks from today. Today's host is Michigan State University. I will now turn the discussion over to Caitlin Cornell, Assistant Director of the Center for Language Teaching Advancement at Michigan State University, to introduce our guest speaker and to begin the discussion. Caitlin?
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today my colleague, Elizabeth Ablan. I've been pronouncing her last name wrong for a while, apparently, so I was practicing that leading into today. Elizabeth is a second-year graduate student in the MA TESOL program here at Michigan State University. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education and Spanish and completed the CELTA certificate to teach English to speakers of other languages. Her teaching experiences include elementary, middle, and high school Spanish, migrant education, and online business English coaching. Her research interests focus on equitable education policy for English learners in the state of Michigan, and, as we're going to hear about today, trauma-sensitive teaching practices. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Hello.
Personally, I'm really itching to revisit some of what you've already taught me a little bit about this topic, but I think for the sake of everyone else, we should start broadly. So I was hoping that you could start off by telling us what is trauma-sensitive teaching practices?
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and I learned about the trauma-sensitive teaching practices. And since then, I have just been fascinated by it. There's an author and educator, Patricia Jennings, and she defines trauma. I think that's the definition that I'm going to use because I think she does a really nice job with it. She designs trauma-sensitive teaching practices are educational practices that are intentional about creating safe learning environments and seeks to address and mitigate the effects of trauma on student learning. And so I'm fascinated by it. It's really great.
That's a great start. Thanks for that. So what counts as trauma?
That is a great question. So traditionally or historically, we have used the word trauma. I know in my own personal life, I've thought of trauma as like one very significant big event. You know, I think of violence or I think of war. But what we're finding, there's been a turn in literature and in the last, I'd say, a decade or so, where the definition of trauma is being expanded to include things such as anything that is traumatic to an individual. So trauma could be too much, too soon, too fast. That's kind of like the gauge when we're talking about with younger students or anyone really. If anything that comes into you into your life is if it's too much, too soon, too fast. And this could be, and it has a negative effect on your life. So this could be the separation of your parents, a divorce. It could be neglect. It could be poverty. It could be racial discrimination. It could be, domestic violence. It could be hospitalizations. Anything that the gamut is quite broad, and so what they're finding is that with this broad definition, there's a lot that's affected within the classroom.
I forgot I muted myself. Thanks for that. That's great. Something that was really interesting to me when we talked about broadening that definition. My next question, it's one of the more interesting aspects for me of what you and I talked about earlier. Could you explain what's unique about trauma then in that wider definition when it's happening during a pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. So what we're seeing, or what's happening in the pandemic is quite significant, but I have to go back to how the brain operates. So what they're finding with trauma sensitive practices is the brain is basically an association machine. And we can see that when we read research, when we read literature, we read something and we go, oh, that reminds me of this. That reminds me of this literature. It happens, we're constantly associating things in our brain. That's just how it operates. And the same thing can be done with our sensory experiences, right? Because our brain holds those memories in our sensory beings. And so, let's say, for example, you had a negative experience with a dog when you were young. Well, now every time you see a dog, you get sweaty palms, your heart starts beating, and that's a sensory reaction because it's associating something in the past. It could also be for good things too. You hear a song and it immediately takes you back to a memory. You smell something, it takes you back to something in your childhood, good feelings, positive feelings. And so we see this association happening not only in our sensory being, but also with emotions. So any emotion, and then it's just compounding that. And so one emotion that we see that I've heard a lot in this last year with the pandemic is grief. And again, the definition of grief, we think of, yes, obviously the impact and the sadness of losing someone or something. But in the broader sense, we have had collectively as a society, we have lost a lot of things, lost the ability to connect with one another on a daily basis, lost opportunities to network at conferences, lost rites of passage like graduation ceremonies. And so there's just this collective grief, you can say, that's happening. And then what's happening then in the subconscious in our brains is that it's activating and it's triggering prior experiences with grief. And so then things get compounded, like I said. So we have this compound effect within the context of this global pandemic. And then what's even taking it a step further is we were kind of all in the spring last year, but now it's been a year of it. And so our brains are just kind of processing a lot right now. And so then taking it to the classroom, we think, well, why is something, I think in my own life, why is something that I would knock out in 10 minutes? Why is it taking me so long to produce something, to think through something? Well, if you take a step back, and that's what trauma sensitive practices do, you take a step back and you think, okay, the brain is processing a lot right now. It's inputting, it's categorizing, it's the sensory is taking a lot, and that takes energy. And so what would normally take us something, like I said, something quick to knock out is now taking longer. And then if we can think of that in our own lives, then we think of that with our students, in our classrooms, what's happening in their lives. Like, okay, something that I used to get work in that was at this quality is now sometimes a little less, or I'm noticing a lag, or just different things. You started to notice this as teachers. So it's all connected. It's quite fascinating.
That was a beautiful segue into one of my next questions. You started talking about education. My next question was going to be, this all makes sense to me. And it's incredible to think of what we all and students are going through right now that we may not even realize, especially in that expanded definition of trauma and grief. So what, in your professional opinion, what do you think of this is relevant or particularly important for foreign and second language teaching and learning?
It's a great question. Yes. So one thing that sticks out to me in particular is working memory. So when we're learning a language, it takes a lot of working memory to work through some of the structures, the functions, the vocabulary. And if a brain is stressed, you can see the effects, or there's research that negatively affects a stressed brain negatively affects the working memory. And so if there's been trauma, or there's been collective trauma, or there's something going on in a student's life, then their ability to learn a language is impaired because they're struggling. Something that was fascinating to me as a teacher when it was explained to me as I was learning about trauma sensitive teaching practices is, I don't know if this has happened to you. This has happened to me many times, where I have explained everything, step by step, written it on the board, gave a demonstration, modeled it, you name it, the whole 9 yards. And then I'm like, okay, ready, go. And you send, your students off, and then immediately a hand comes up and they say, what are we supposed to do? And you're just like, okay. Well, yep, we can do this. And so, in my mind, you kind of get frustrated. You're like, oh goodness, this is a lot. But then if you, through the lens of trauma sensitive practices, you think, oh, what else is going on? If this individual's brain is stressed, then the working memory, it's not their fault. You might, you have to think like, okay, like you have to take into the bigger picture. And that's what I think is great about the trauma sensitive practices, is it takes into consideration the bigger picture, and it shifts. It doesn't, it doesn't excuse, but it definitely shifts your perspective to look at something from a slightly different angle, to then maybe your approach might be slightly different, to then be more compassionate in your response to the student. And I think that that's the main goal of these practices. Mm-hmm. One thing that definitely stood out to me as I'm learning about this, and it impacted me, and what kind of kept me going in this is I was shown a brain scan of what a stressed brain looks like. And so I'm going to show you that real quick. And this is just a quick Google search, so it wasn't, you can definitely scan stress or search stressed brains scans yourself, but I'm going to share that with you real quick because it made an impact on me. So you can see that we have the healthy brain on the left, and then we have the abused brain or the neglected brain on the right. And you can see from these scans just how significant the brain is impacted, which then impacts their ability to learn and to be present. And so when that student raises their hand and say, what are we supposed to do? This picture actually comes up in my head, and I go, what else is going on? How can I respond in a way that's edifying and encouraging? Not that I wouldn't in the first place, but just shifts my perspective a little bit. Mm-hmm.
I think it's certainly something to keep in mind. That was really a powerful image for me too, to actually be reminded of the physiological changes that happen as a result of trauma. Thank you for sharing that. You said you just found that in a Google search?
Yeah, a quick one. Okay. I just put it on here real quick for easy access.
No, that's great. That's great. So I know that some of your background is in the K-12 realm. Mm-hmm. And having kids myself, not teaching them, but having them, I can imagine how this must manifest maybe in some K-12 classrooms. What would you say is the difference between maybe identifying trauma, or working with trauma in K-12 versus in higher ed? What might we need to keep in mind in a higher ed context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the higher ed context, you're working with older students whose brains are still developing. So we know that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the age of 25. And so you're working with someone who is still developing their brain themselves and still working through whatever they're working through. And so what we'll see with older students is they've had more practice. Maybe practice isn't the right word, but they've honed their, some of them maybe maladaptive coping skills to a point where to be functional in society. And one of those ways is disassociation. So they disassociate themselves from what happened. This could look like being aloof, or I don't care, or yeah, just kind of being hands off, or just like, oh, they wouldn't mind, they don't really care. You know, having the laissez-faire kind of attitude, but that's actually one of the coping mechanisms that we'll see with older students, where a lot of they take they disassociate themselves from it, and because they have had practice in it, they're probably, I don't want to say good but they've probably had a lot of practice in that, so it's going to be harder to see. But again, having that brief little bit of knowledge can kind of shed light into something if you're having a conversation with a student, I think is really helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm trying to do a good job of checking in with the chat, because I think now we're ready to open it up to other questions. I have grilled you long enough.
Oh yeah, welcome. I welcome. Uh-huh.
Tina's made a really nice contribution in the chat, saying that it's hard to do all these right things when we're all running out of steam.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For myself, for others.
It looks like, Go ahead. No, finish, please.
Oh no, there's a lot of energy going out, and that's where like our brains are, like what I was talking about. It takes a lot of energy on our parts as educators to then even think about these extra layers of compassion in these settings. So absolutely, it's
certainly this applies to teachers too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yana, I think, has her hand up.
Thanks. So my question is, Elizabeth, how do you make connections with those students who are affected by trauma more than others? Because some students are affected stronger, and at times it might be difficult. You know, they work in groups, they work in pairs. How do you really capture it in the class? You know, because I could imagine that some of the practices might slow down, or, you know, with your expectations and things like that. So kind of applying it across the board, it kind of depends then, you know, how it's going to affect what you really wanted to accomplish in a class. But for those students who are dealing with some really serious issues, how do you call, well, you don't really call them out, right? But how do you connect with them? How do you let them come to you? And there is a big chance that they won't. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like, I would almost think that's something to put in the beginning of the semester, to make sure that they're aware that you are aware that might come up, might be helpful. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think something that I've read, and that goes back to the definition, is creating that safe environment. And one of the things that is really, that keeps coming up that I see repeatedly is structure, not to the point where it's rigid, but just to the point where routines are a comfort, in the sense that you demystify and decrease the anxiety of the unknown. So if you can do that for students in a way that this is what we do, this is our rhythm, you know, you are very clear with your expectations and kind of the flow of how a class will go or how the semester will go, it kind of demystifies it, and it creates a safe environment to then go the next step to say, okay, this is I can manage this. This is manageable, to then take the next step to hopefully connect. But that's one thing that came to mind as you were speaking, but that you do make a great point. Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing another question in the chat that probably is for anybody who's here, really, who can speak to this. wondering how many institutions out there are talking, more widely about the trauma of the pandemic and how it might affect students' learning processes long term.
I'm curious too.
Great question.
Yes, I do know that trauma, how do I say, trauma-informed practices, I think that Patricia Jennings makes the distinction, because you'll often hear them interchanged, where trauma-informed is more from a medical standpoint, or maybe a mental health standpoint, whereas trauma sensitive is then more in the educational realm. And I think that it's up and coming. I think that it has been received some attention, but it's not to the point where people will say, oh yeah, I understand. Or, some, like me, I was a couple of years ago, said, what is this? I'm so fascinated. I know that I attended a conference this past spring that was Trauma Sensitive Teaching Network, and it was the 4th annual one. So it's not, it's fairly recent, I will say, but I am also curious too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I've heard more chatter. I'm not deeply involved in K-12 settings, but I have family members who work for K-12. So I've heard a bit more chatter about trauma sensitive and trauma informed practices in that realm. That's a really good question. I wonder. Do we have any other questions from the group? Go ahead, Elizabeth, if you have something to share.
No, you're good.
We do have another one. Can you share other basic principles of trauma sensitive teaching?
Yes. So principles in, like, you were thinking of like the routines, or just
this is coming from the chat, so I don't know.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was me. I guess I was just thinking, because you've mentioned, creating a safe environment, and I guess I'm thinking of something more concrete or similarly concrete. Are there other kind of main principles or practices that we can really be aware of concretely when we're, say, planning lessons or, meeting with students, things like that?
Yeah. I think it's all that's a great question. It's going to depend on each teacher and what they're teaching and what their style is. Obviously, opening yourself up is, we have to be protective of our own time and energies as well. But I think one of the things that helps students is to give them multiple on-ramps to ask for help. So this could be, emailing you ahead of time, or, emailing after, or, anonymous surveys. Maybe the anonymity of it would help them to open up about what's going on. I think the routines, like I had mentioned, that's really important. A lot of unknowns. So like in a trauma sensitive practice, if we put ourselves in the shoes of a student, a lot of the trauma has been unexpected or out of their control. And so something that happens with, that I've read up on, is there's this sense of a lack of control. And so what happens when we feel a lack of control, we tend to grasp at things to try to control in our lives. So maybe giving students a choice between two different things, you have this assignment, or here's an alternative. So that's a huge thing that helps, because it gives them some autonomy. It gives them the right to have, to think, I'm going to do this for myself, in my life. And yeah, I think that would be, that's huge. That's something that I've read a lot up on. Mm-hmm. Is there another one I think I see? Oh.
Can I raise my hand? Yes. Just a couple of observations. I mean, I really was struck by the repetition that you mentioned, this something that causes you to re-experience the sort of traumatic. And that's boy, really been driven home to me this year as we're redoing what we did last year. I mean, we're basically, the environment is the same. The sun is where it was last year. The weather is what it was last year, and we're just going through it again. And it's causing me to relive all of these other things. So, that really makes sense. And I'm sure that that's happening with students as well. And I guess the question that I would have is, we've got students now that have been through a year of this, and if all goes well, they're all going to be back in person in the fall. Might it be a good idea to consider that it's not the exceptional student that might be suffering from trauma, but it's the norm?
Yes, I would say so. Absolutely. I think approaching the classroom in the fall or the summer and understanding that there's all of us, we have collectively, like I had mentioned, we have collectively felt the heaviness of this and the grit, or just kind of pushing through the grind, if you will. That takes a toll. That takes a toll on your cognitive abilities to function how they optimally should. And so when that's kind of in the background, so like our brains are, these complex, this complex organ that's just constantly going. And if that's like, buzzing in the background, that's taking up energy, whether we know it or not. And so then you have to, if you're trying to keep up with everything else going on with that buzzing in the background for a year, you're going to be tired. Students will be affected. I'm curious myself how it will look, how students will react, how the classroom, how things will be in the fall. And I think for me, I want to approach it as not to like open it up and let's have this big discussion about it. I mean, if that's helpful and you feel that your class is open to it, by all means, go for it. But I think also just being aware, acknowledging it, but acknowledging it in a sensitive way, acknowledging it in a way that says, we collectively have been through this. Here's some ways that we're going to move forward in this class. And here's, if you need anything, here's some extra supports, and then move forward with that. I'm curious too, how that will be.
I'm just thinking we need to be adjusting our expectations going into the fall so that we're not, we're all talking about it's going to be like 2019 again, but it's not. And so kind of rather than running into a wall when we hit the fall, we should be ready for accommodating both students and ourselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think check-ins would be huge. Even with me and my work, when I have, hey, this is due, but 2 weeks before, let me see what you got. Like that's been helpful, because then I'm like, oh, okay, yes, like there's some accountability there. The pressure is like, it's not 100% due, but it's kept me on track enough to say, okay, I'm putting something down on paper. So adjusting expectations, I think, is huge. Maybe not like, yes, using the same syllabi, but then, or the same assignments, but like I said, maybe the deadlines look different. Maybe there's an extra check-in. Maybe there's, maybe you revise your syllabi to talk about extensions. What happens when a student is unable to produce what is expected of them and they're frustrated. What about extensions? What does that look like? How could we, is there some type of safety net that they know that, hey, things happen, it's okay. This is how we're going to handle this situation. So yeah.
We've got another good question from the chat. Specifically, it's asking about if there's a website that you could direct folks to for a little more information about trauma-sensitive teaching practices. But this reminds me too that there was a book that you wanted to share with us.
Yes. So I will try to look up the website real quick. I mentioned her before. So Patricia Jennings she has a book that's called, I don't know if you guys can see it, The Trauma Sensitive Classroom. Fascinating, because it goes into the neurological processes and then takes you through this whole, checklist, gives you checklists to kind of, maybe not checklist is the right word, but kind of a guide to know what to do or how to set up a classroom. It is geared, I would say, I don't think it's geared specifically for K-12. I think it's open to all students. I think any instructor where you have students in front of you would benefit from understanding how the brain works, how it's connected to learning, how students show up, and what are the symptoms or what are the signs that they, the aloofness that might be misinterpreted as something else, but actually are something related to trauma. Yes, you can find it on Amazon. Yep.
Lots of resources in the chat now. I love it.
Yes.
I'm going to jump in for just a second to remind folks that we are now officially at the end of our time, but we're happy to stick around for another 10, 15 minutes to carry on the conversation. We don't want to keep you longer than we promised we would. So feel free. If you need to go, that's great. And it's been great to see you. And I want to thank Elizabeth for sharing with us what she's been working with and just fascinating stuff. And thank Caitlin for hosting us. And thank you all for coming.